My name is Adam Schiffer. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science here at TCU. This is my 7th year at TCU after having done my doctoral work at the University of North Carolina. And let's get one thing out of the way first. You may be a bit confused by the title, so let me go ahead and clarify. A single action by 12 Texas Senate Republicans in the 2007 legislative session enabled Obama to win the presidency. Wait, did I say clarify? I may confuse you. We will solve the puzzle at the end of the talk, but first let's do some political science. In a democracy, we like to believe that majority preferences, say whether Congress wants a bill to pass or not, leads directly to outcomes. The bill passes. But one of the most important theoretical insights in poli-sci is that far more often than we might believe, the structure trumps preferences in deciding the outcome. Now, what do I mean by structure? Well, let me give you an easy example that we all know. In the 2000 presidential election, Al Gore won approximately 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush. But of course, US presidential elections aren't decided by the popular vote. Instead, the rules of the game empower an institution to decide the outcome. In this case, the Constitution, Article 2, empowered the Electoral College to decide the outcome that usually matches the popular vote winner, except when it doesn't. Now that's obvious, but let's talk about primaries and caucuses, or the way that parties choose their presidential nominees. In this case, the rules of the game, for now we'll call it our wacky primary system, enable the news media. That's right. If I were to say that the press chooses our nominees for us, I would be exaggerating, but only slightly. The press have a profound impact on primary elections. Why? Well, for starters, the citizen's task in a primary is very difficult. In a general election, a vast majority of party identifiers vote for their guy, as you can see happened in 2008. This is actually a pretty good way to vote. If you strongly favor the priorities of one party over the other, then you'll almost always be right about which candidate will better serve your interests just by knowing their party. But we don't have that shortcut in primaries. And it gets worse. In a general election, there are usually only 2 viable candidates, and they tend to be pretty far apart on most of the hottest issues that year. Or cool issues. By contrast, a primary could have 8, as many as 10 candidates, and their positions on most of the important issues that year are usually pretty similar. So the bottom line is, choosing your party's nominee is a very difficult task. And as such, most citizens are entirely dependent on the press for information. Yet, the media only gives serious coverage to maybe 3 or 4 candidates. So by the time most citizens are even paying attention, the press has already eliminated most of the candidates from the field. And once the press winnows the field, they play a huge role in shaping the candidates' fates by imposing narratives on each outcome. In a general election, the outcome is so clear and obvious that the press has no choice but to cover it accurately. But can you imagine a major news organization trying to get away with something like this? No, of course not. On the other hand, our wacky primary system consists of a series of primaries and caucuses, starting with 2 small, largely rural, almost all-white states, peaking a month later with half the nation voting on Super Tuesday, and then the other half of the states staggered across the next 4 months. Ultimately, it's a race for delegates, and each state has its own complex, peculiar mechanisms for translating the primary and caucus outcomes into delegates. It's this complexity and ambiguity that give the press its power to shape the narratives in whatever fashion they please. Now you might say, well, hold on a second, whatever fashion they please? No, that can't be right. I remember Obama and Huckabee won Iowa, Clinton and McCain won New Hampshire. I remember the press covering it exactly as such. So what's the problem? But here's where I urge you to step back and take a critical look at the way the primaries are covered, and whether there are other equally plausible ways they could have been covered that would have had very different implications. So let's look at the coverage. Start with Iowa. You can see Obama and Huckabee triumph. They are leaders of the pack. They jump to the front already. Oh, Obama's commanding win makes him the front runner. Wow! Shazam! No, really. Now let's look at New Hampshire. The evening belonged to Clinton and McCain, and a theme quickly emerged in the coverage. Let me see if you can find it.
Interesting.
In fairness, a few editors pulled out their thesaurus and referred to it instead as or how about a stunning comeback? So you can see what happens. The narrative emerges election night on the cable news channels, and by morning, everybody's reading from the same script. But let's take a critical look at this coverage. Was this really the most accurate way to cover the first two contests? To find out, let's look at what really happened in those contests, starting with what I can only describe as Iowa's super wacky caucus system. All right. First of all, who won the popular vote? Well, because of the complexity of their caucus system, they're unable to count it. I'm not kidding. Instead, they tabulate the winners of each of the several thousand caucuses, put it into a fancy mathematical formula, and you get the overall result. Now, you can see Obama did win, but it was hardly a blowout. Now, how many delegates did they each win, since that's what really matters? Well, that's actually impossible to know on election night as well. You can't know it until the state convention a couple months later, just like in Texas. But the media estimates on election night were as follows. Notice they don't track very well with the caucus outcome. Again, it's a super wacky system. Now, let's focus on Obama and Clinton. Obama's resounding victory was by one delegate. Now check this out. In order to win the nomination, a Democrat needs 2,118 delegates. So Iowa provided Obama with fewer than 1% of what he needed. Percentage-wise, it's actually very similar to the first game of a 162-game baseball season. Now, can you imagine logging onto the Star-Telegram website, seeing that the Rangers lost a close game on opening day, and then reading, "Season ruined, no hope for the series"? Of course not. The writer would be laughed out of the newsroom. And yet, for some reason, we let political journalists get away with equally dubious narratives.